On a freezing Christmas Eve, a powerful millionaire CEO walked away from the glittering lights of a ballroom, carrying nothing but silence in his heart. He thought he was leaving behind a party, but what he found instead was a little girl, trembling on a bench, clutching an old backpack as if it was her last shield against the world. And then came the whisper, so small, so fragile, that it pierced through every wall he had built. "Please hold my hand, I'm scared." That moment changed everything. It was no longer about wealth, contracts, or success. It was about a hand that refused to let go, and a story that would redefine what family truly means. If you believe in love that shows up when it's least expected, stay with us. Subscribe to Hidden Echo Stories and discover tales that heal, inspire, and remind us what it means to be human. The city glimmered with gold that Christmas Eve, the kind of night when the skyline looked more like a painting than reality. Champagne lights spilled from the ballroom windows of Langford Tower, where Boston's most powerful gathered in laughter and applause. Men in tailored suits clinked glasses, women draped in sequins exchanged polished smiles, and every corner hummed with celebration. At the center of it all stood Ethan Blake, a man whose name had become synonymous with ambition, success, and relentless drive. He had just secured the largest commercial property contract in a decade. Everyone around him called it legendary. But Ethan felt nothing. The applause echoed hollow. The congratulatory texts arriving on his phone felt like static. Not one message asked if he was happy. Not one voice wondered if he was lonely. Behind every toast and every smile lingered an emptiness he had learned to bury under layers of routine and responsibility. He slipped out before they could announce his name. His coat swayed behind him as he stepped into the private elevator, ignoring the pleas of his assistant to stay. Downstairs, the sleek black car waited like a shadow. The driver asked, "Home, sir?" But Ethan hesitated. Home was a penthouse filled with silence, a place where even the hum of the refrigerator sounded like an echo. He asked to be dropped near the old Kenmore station instead. The night air was sharp, biting against his skin as he stepped onto the deserted sidewalk. Snow drifted down in thick flakes, dusting the ground in fragile white. He pulled his collar up, ready to walk the city streets until the cold forced him back inside. But then, something shifted. At first he thought it was just the wind catching in the empty station. But then he noticed the small figure, curled tightly on a wooden bench. She was impossibly still, except for the faint shiver running through her shoulders. A little girl no more than 7, dressed in a thin jacket that had lost its warmth long ago. Her knees were pulled close, her arms locked around a worn-out pink backpack. She did not cry. She did not beg. She simply existed in that cold silence, as if waiting for someone who never came. Ethan's steps slowed. He could have kept walking. He could have convinced himself it was none of his business. That was what the old Ethan would have done: bury his discomfort, pass by quickly, pretend not to see. But something about the way she sat, so composed in her fear, pulled at him. Her eyes lifted, dark, wide, unblinking, and then she spoke, her voice softer than the snow falling around them. "Please hold my hand, I'm scared." The words cracked something deep inside him. For years he had built walls higher than the skyline itself, walls made of steel and ambition. And in an instant those walls shook. He froze, staring at her, unsure if he had imagined it. But then her small hand stretched out, trembling beneath the frayed sleeve of her coat. Her fingers looked too fragile for the world they had been forced to survive in. "I can't stay here," she whispered again, barely louder than the wind. "He might come back." Ethan glanced around, but the streets were deserted. Christmas Eve had drawn people into warmth, into living rooms lit by fireplaces and kitchens filled with laughter. No one noticed her, no one but him. He knelt down slowly, lowering himself so their eyes were level. "Where's your mother?" he asked gently. Her lips parted, but only one word came out: "Gone." His throat tightened. "Your father?" Her lip trembled. "Not my real dad, he said he was, but when Mommy got sick he got mean." Snow was collecting on her hair now, resting on her lashes like tiny crystals. He reached out, uncertain, then paused. She beat him to it. She extended her hand once more, and this time he did not hesitate. He slid his gloved palm into hers, and her fingers clung instantly, cold and small, but desperate with a strength that startled him. The moment her hand closed around his, something unfamiliar washed over him. A memory, maybe, of days long buried. He had not held a child's hand since his own past had unraveled. And now, here she was, stitching something back together with nothing more than her fragile grip. Her name, she said, was Stella. She spoke it like a secret she was afraid to share, her voice breaking on the last syllable. And Ethan, a man who had mastered control, who could close billion-dollar deals without blinking, felt utterly undone by 3 simple words that followed. "Please don't let him find me." The air grew colder, or perhaps it was just the weight of her plea settling into his chest. For the first time in years, Ethan Blake realized he was standing at a crossroads that had nothing to do with contracts, power, or wealth. It had everything to do with a trembling little girl asking him to stay. He did not know what the night would bring. He did not know how a man like him could protect someone so fragile. But as her hand tightened around his, one truth became undeniable. He was not walking away. The bell above the diner door rang as Ethan stepped inside, holding the little girl's hand. The rush of warm air hit his face, carrying the smell of coffee, bacon, and buttered toast. It felt strangely comforting, though he had never been one for late-night diners. Stella pressed close against his side, clutching her backpack to her chest as though it were armor. A waitress with weary eyes approached, eyeing the expensive coat on Ethan's shoulders and the small girl at his side. "Coffee?" she asked flatly. "Just water," Ethan said before lowering his gaze to Stella. "What would you like?" She did not answer. Her eyes darted nervously around the room, flinching every time the bell above the door jingled. She looked less like a child out for food and more like a cornered animal, ready to flee at the slightest threat. Ethan slid into a booth and gently nudged her to join him. "You're safe here," he said softly. Her lips parted as if to answer, but no words came. She only nodded and stared at the laminated menu, as though it were written in a language she had never seen. When the food arrived, pancakes, eggs, grilled cheese, and chocolate milk, Stella barely touched it. She peeled at the edges of the bread, her fork dragging crumbs across the plate. Ethan watched, then leaned closer. "I know you're scared," he whispered, "but you are not alone tonight." Her eyes flicked up, enormous in her small face. "He always said no one would help, that people like you don't care." The words stung. Ethan leaned back, caught between anger and shame. He had built his reputation on power, on never bending, on ruthlessness. People admired him for his brilliance, but never for his kindness. And now, this little girl was telling him the truth he had spent his life ignoring. "He said people with money only help when cameras are around," she added, her voice trembling. Ethan swallowed. "Maybe he is right," he admitted quietly, "but I am here and no one is watching." Something in her posture softened. For the first time that night, she reached for the chocolate milk and took a tiny sip. Outside, snow continued to fall, the world muffled in white silence. His phone buzzed relentlessly on the table. 7 missed calls from Laura, his assistant. Urgent. The board was waiting. Contracts hung in the balance. But for the first time in years, the urgency did not grip him. He turned the phone over, silencing it. Later in the restroom mirror, Ethan barely recognized the man staring back at him. Perfect hair, polished coat, a face built on control. Yet overlaid on that reflection were Stella's frightened eyes. He braced both hands on the sink. What was he doing here, babysitting a lost child when he had an empire to run? And yet when he stepped out, the answer was waiting. Stella had fallen asleep in the booth, her small hand stretched across the table, palm open as if still reaching for him. "She yours?" the waitress asked quietly. "No," Ethan said after a pause, "but I think I am hers for now." Hours later, under the harsh lights of the hospital, Ethan walked beside a gurney. Stella's backpack was clutched in one hand, his coat draped over the other. Nurses examined her gently, speaking in careful tones. She answered little, her voice a whisper, but she never let go of his hand. The pediatrician confirmed what Ethan feared: multiple bruises, malnourishment, signs of trauma. Social services would have to intervene. When Stella overheard the words foster care, panic shot through her small frame. She cried out, begging not to be sent back. Ethan knelt beside her, his voice steady though his chest felt like it was breaking. "You will not face this alone," he promised. A woman from Child Protective Services, Karen Douglas, arrived with her clipboard. She questioned Ethan, her tone professional, cautious. Why was a powerful CEO suddenly entangled in the life of a stranger's child? Ethan's answer was simple, almost too simple. Because she asked me to hold her hand. Karen studied him, skeptical yet moved. Protocol demanded Stella be placed elsewhere, but Ethan's determination pressed against the rules. He offered to sign anything, pay for private nurses, cover every cost, do whatever it took to keep her safe that night. Karen hesitated, then finally agreed to make some calls. Back in the hospital room, Stella whispered, "You came back." "I told you I would," Ethan replied. She searched his face, her eyes brimming with a fragile hope she barely dared to trust. That night, when the room quieted, she reached out once more. Her small hand brushed the sleeve of his coat, a silent reminder that trust had been given. Ethan felt the weight of it more than any contract he had ever signed. And as the hours stretched on, with Stella sleeping beside him and the glow of monitors filling the silence, Ethan understood. He had stepped into something irreversible. A stranger's plea had unraveled his life, but in its place, it had offered him something far greater, something he had not even known he was missing. The courthouse was heavy with silence, the kind that clings to the walls and makes every step echo louder than it should. Ethan Blake sat at the long, polished table, hands folded tightly, his jaw rigid. He had faced boardrooms full of investors ready to devour him, but this was different. Across from him sat Rick Donovan, cleaned up in a wrinkled navy suit that could not mask the wildness in his eyes. Beside him were two older figures, Stella's maternal grandparents, stern and cold as stone. At Ethan's side sat Stella, dressed in a yellow dress she had chosen herself that morning. She had whispered it made her feel like sunshine, though now her face was pale, her hands clenched in her lap. When the judge entered, Stella flinched so sharply that Ethan instinctively reached for her hand. She took it immediately, gripping so hard it hurt. He welcomed the pain. It was proof of her trust. Rick's lawyer painted him as a devoted guardian, a man who had stepped in when Stella's biological father vanished. He described Ethan as an intruder, a stranger with money trying to claim a child who was not his. Ethan's lips pressed thin, every muscle tight, but he stayed silent. He could not fight lies with anger, not here. Then it was Stella's turn. She looked impossibly small in the witness chair, feet dangling above the ground. The judge leaned forward kindly. "You can just talk to me, sweetheart." Stella's voice was barely a whisper. "He yelled a lot. He scared me." Her throat bobbed as she swallowed. "Sometimes he hurt me." Rick stiffened, but the room seemed to stop breathing. "How do you feel living with Mr. Blake?" the judge asked softly. Stella's eyes filled with tears. She looked toward Ethan and the words broke from her lips like a prayer. "Safe. I want to stay with him. Please, I want to stay with him." The entire courtroom went silent. Even Rick did not speak. It was not legal language. It was not strategy. It was the raw, desperate truth of a child. The back door creaked open. A frail woman stepped inside, wrapped in a gray coat, her hair thin beneath a scarf. Gasps rippled through the room. Maria Morgan, Stella's mother, thought to be gone, yet here she was, trembling but alive. She carried documents, medical records, rehab certificates, and a voice unsteady but resolute. "I did not leave her by choice. I fought my way back to her." The judge reviewed the evidence. Karen Douglas confirmed the story. The grandparents, once so stern, seemed shaken to silence. Stella stared at her mother, torn between longing and disbelief. When Maria whispered, "It is me, sweetheart," Stella froze. She did not run into her arms. Instead, she glanced at Ethan, her grip on his hand unbroken. "Can I still stay with him, even if she is here?" she asked the judge in a trembling voice. Ethan knelt, his eyes level with hers. "You do not have to choose. If your mom is getting better, that is something we can be thankful for, but you will not lose me." The judge, visibly moved, declared temporary joint guardianship for Ethan Blake and Maria Morgan. Stella would remain primarily in Ethan's care while Maria continued her rehabilitation. The gavel struck, but no one rushed to leave. The decision was only the beginning. In the weeks that followed, the penthouse no longer felt like a fortress. Maria visited under Corinne's supervision, slowly regaining strength. She read to Stella, braided her hair, sang lullabies long forgotten. Ethan watched from a distance, not as a rival, but as a guardian who had been chosen in the darkest moment and now stood as a bridge between mother and child. Life began to fill the once sterile apartment. Crayon drawings covered the refrigerator. Laughter echoed in the halls. Stella moved through the space with ease, her small presence grounding Ethan in ways success never had. One evening, she proudly handed him a new drawing. 3 stick figures under a bright sun. Above it, in uneven letters, she had written, "Our home." Then came the confrontation Ethan had anticipated. His phone buzzed with a short, cold message. The board had voted him out. The company he had built was no longer his. The old Ethan would have burned the city to reclaim it. But this Ethan simply deleted the message. Across the room, Stella giggled with Maria, crayons scattered across the floor. Ethan looked at them, and for the first time he felt no sense of loss. He had already gained what mattered. That night, as the city glowed under the thaw of early spring, Stella climbed onto his lap, her arms clutching his neck. "I am glad I asked you to hold my hand," she whispered. Ethan closed his eyes, holding her close. "Me too, kiddo," he said softly, his voice breaking. "You changed everything." And for the man who once measured his life in contracts and acquisitions, there was no truer victory than this. The sound of a child breathing safely beside him, the warmth of a home filled with second chances, and the knowledge that he would never again walk alone. There are stories that entertain us, stories that pass the time, and then there are stories that stay, etched into our hearts long after the final word. This was one of them. A man who had everything found himself empty. A child who had nothing found herself lost. By the chance of a snowy night and a trembling whisper, their paths collided. It was not destiny written in the stars. It was something simpler and perhaps more profound. One human being choosing not to walk away. Ethan Blake was not a hero when he left that ballroom. He was tired, disconnected, and surrounded by all the things the world calls success. Yet when Stella looked up at him, asking for nothing more than a hand to hold, he discovered the one thing he could never buy: trust. And once given, it changed him more than any victory ever had. In Stella's fear, he found purpose. In her laughter, he found hope. And in her fragile hand holding on to his, he found a family he never expected. Together they faced shadows of the past, abuse, loss, a broken system, even the return of her mother. None of it was easy. There were courts, there were arguments, there were moments when the future felt unbearably uncertain. But in the midst of it all, they built something stronger than fear: belonging. For Stella, it meant safety. For Maria, it meant redemption. And for Ethan, it meant finally understanding that true wealth is not measured in contracts or skyscrapers, but in the small, unshakable bonds that make a home. Perhaps that is the heart of every story worth telling. Not perfection, not fairy tale endings, but people who choose each other when they have every reason not to. People who decide to stay when walking away would be easier. As the snow melted into spring, Stella's drawings filled the once sterile walls of Ethan's apartment. Her laughter replaced the silence he had lived with for years, and every time she reached for his hand, it reminded him, and all of us, that sometimes the greatest changes in life come in the smallest gestures. If this story touched something inside you, Let it be a reminder that compassion is not grand, it is simple. It is the choice to listen, to stay, to care when no one else will. And those choices, however small, have the power to change a life. Here at Hidden Echo Stories, we believe in sharing these moments, the kind that echo in our hearts, the kind that remind us of our shared humanity. If you felt moved, inspired, or simply reminded that love can appear in the unlikeliest of places, we invite you to stay with us. Subscribe to Hidden Echo Stories, because sometimes the stories we hold on to are the ones that hold us together.